Can I ask all of the panelists to come up to the table and join me? And I hope I'm doing this right, yeah. So I have a lot of questions and comments. They made such interesting presentations that cut across literally the scales. But why don't I first turn to you in the room? And then those of you who want to join us and ask questions via live stream, Simone will be monitoring, and then Simone, you'll raise your hand when you have live stream questions. But don't be shy. Any questions, comments, suggestions, you heard them, including any hopes and that you have for COP21 that you hope they hear and take also there. And then the audience has never been shy here, and please name an institution.
I'm Rebecca Regan-Sachs with TechnoServe, and I was curious the extent to which the upcoming Paris talks will focus on the impact of climate change on smallholder farmers in particular, who are among the most vulnerable to climate change, and what are the priorities that you would like to see at this conference that would best help smallholder farmers? Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Why don't I come back to the panel? Who of you would like to address that briefly?
Yeah, my sense at this point is the talks themselves are, they're global. They're not directly touching smallholders as an issue, but there is growing attention to the impacts of climate change in the talks. For a very long time, the talks really had been almost all about emissions, and slowly over time there's been more and more treatment of adaptation. I think as we see the attention shift, and this is happening in the negotiations themselves, and it will happen if the negotiations don't work out as well, attention will be shifting to national policy and to creating a cycle of commitments and implementation of commitments and accountability for commitments at the global level that leads to action at the national and subnational level. And it's in the national creation of those commitments and policies that there's the real opportunity for emphasizing the needs of smallholders like this. I also think there is a good possibility of a set of global principles coming out of the adaptation components of the global talks, and those could focus attention on the most vulnerable, which would include smallholders. Whether it explicitly cites them, probably not.
Mark, did you want to come in also?
Briefly, just to follow up on what Heather said, which is exactly right. I think one of the key things then that has to happen here, given it's at the global level, is to try to establish the more substantial funding facilities that can be then used for small farmers in developing countries. As it stands now, those figures have been very small and basically constrain what can be done. But if we can open that envelope a little bit at the global level, so that then as small farmer-oriented initiatives go forward, there would be money that could be tapped into.
Alex, you wanted to come in, and then I'll come
I just wanted to add. So I actually am part of a community that all it does is looking at smallholders. So there is a large community. I mean, Heather, I think you're right in the sense that probably that is not going to be the focus in Paris, right? But there's a large community that is actually looks only at smallholders. And I want to sort of play not the devil advocate, but I think sometimes there's even too much emphasis on smallholders, because in the sense that sometimes we promote policies and some practices at the smallholder level, but we don't know what the repercussion would be of large adoption of those practices. Literally, we don't know. And so this is something that we need to research, because we don't know if there are unintended consequences. If there are, the large-scale adoption might have repercussions that we're not aware of. And I also think that you have to have this combination between sort of country level or maybe regional level type of analysis and household level analysis, and the real challenge is to connect the two. They cannot be disconnected, but you can't just, I think it's, we have to really make a sort of a progress and understand better what happens and the connection between policies at country level and household level decision making.
I'm sure we can continue this, but I see some hands coming up, perhaps on this round. And
Thank you. My name is George Mihalis. I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force, which includes small islands, state, and so on. My question is, you mentioned fertilizer, change in fertilizer, in the case, I believe, of Vietnam. Do you see dramatic possible development in the change in fertilizer from present range of fertilizer? We have chemical one. And do you think, if you can tell us, what is the share or the qualitative and quantitative, the impact of current fertilizer on climate change? Could we use these arguments to allocate more funds to come out with a new categories, non-chemical, natural, whatever? There are some technologies, I have information, but they are still under test in some farms. Small farms, you don't need infrastructure. If it works, we will know in 1 year, but it's a big scale problem because you have transport infrastructure. So how do you see we can handle this? Can we say it's huge impact, and out of 100 billion per year, maybe we give 1 billion or so to this research and dissemination of this? Thank you.
Alex, do you want to comment specifically?
I'm not sure I have a complete answer, but particularly for Vietnam, the issue there of moving away from urea to more efficient type of fertilizers, it's something that we see, and everybody knows there. I mean, the people who work with it, they're very aware of the fact that there are very sort of great alternatives to urea. The problem is that it's either you can't find it, or it's incredibly expensive. And it's the same thing with, we have been recently looking at some alternative for rice production, like a deep urea placement, which is also, it's all a story about either sort of a fertilizer that more efficiently delivers nitrogen, or a more efficiently uses the fertilizer, like in the case of deep urea placement. You always run, I mean, this stuff works, potentially also works in terms of reduction of emissions, but then you run into the usual barriers in terms of cost, labor intensity. They might be labor intensive, and so I'm not sure I have but these are I mean, for an economist, these are the questions that we have been battling forever, right? There's nothing, honestly, there is nothing new. And so the only thing that might change the discourse, it would be if you had a price for carbon, for instance. And then you would have really, it would change the landscape. It would revolutionize the, sort of the landscape and what you're facing. But right now, just because we talk about carbon and we might know what emissions are, nothing has changed. There are the same barriers as before.
Thank you, Alex. If no one else in the panel wants to come in, I did see a hand, I think, somewhere else over here. Or right behind you, sorry. And then there's another hand behind you, Mark, afterwards.
Chen Qiu from IFPRI. So when we talk about climate change and agriculture, we tend to talk about the impacts of climate change on agriculture. And we think that agriculture and the associated producers and consumers are the victim of the climate change. But I wonder if any of you have thought about the potential of agriculture, particularly sustainable agriculture, in mitigate climate change. So the sustainable agriculture I'm talking about is mainly the agroecology path, and it involves a lot of practices like restoration agriculture, permaculture, natural farming, etc. And at the policy level, in COP21, there will be a new policy initiative called 4 per thousand initiative, by the French government to transfer the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the soil with an average annual stock of 4 per thousand 4 per thousand percent per year. So I think agriculture is also a potential. It has the potential to mitigate climate change by having more sustainable agriculture practices like no-till, like maintaining the soil fertility and the health of our ecosystem through polyculture and or even more perennial system. And I think for scientists and economists, can we also have some modeling of the agro-ecosystem? I don't know if that's possible, but I think that's definitely an alternative way of looking at agriculture and to research and more on this alternative path for agriculture. And I wonder if World Resource Institute and IFPRI and other experts have thought about this alternative. Thank you.
Do Heather or Keith want to come in?
Go ahead, and I'll follow them.
I mean, just to speak briefly about work I'm not directly involved in, actually. WRI has a very significant restoration initiative underway and is involved in the 4 by 1,000 initiative, to the best of my knowledge. We're very enthused about landscape approaches and about looking at the landscape level as part of the solution to climate change. And agro-ecosystems and agroforestry in particular are areas where we have quite a bit of work. So I'd encourage you to take a look on our website. In terms of the modeling, we've done some work on the GHG emissions impact. I think it's still early days to understand some of the more nuanced economic pieces, though, and that's an important to do going forward. Thanks.
Sure, and if I can just add, you point to some very important questions, and I think that also relates to some of the issues that have been mentioned by the other panelists in terms of scales of analysis and linking local, subnational, national, global, but also the biophysical with the economic, because it's one issue to better understand the biological and biophysical relationships that you're talking about, but also then when you bring those together with economic relationships and looking at the impacts, scaling up from, well, what happens at the plot level to what happens if 100 smallholders or an entire nation of smallholders do that. It's important to understand those kinds of linkages to have a more complete picture. That's something that we've identified as a challenge that we need to do better on. We're just beginning, but that's an example of some of the work that we're thinking about with colleagues here at the table, but also elsewhere in the room and some of our other partners, in terms of linking different modeling approaches and trying to go beyond our customary model outputs, which are some of the things that I presented, the yields and the prices and the consumption and so forth, but what are the implications then for greenhouse gases, for biodiversity loss, for water quality, and those are all things that are challenging but important, and we're trying to move in that direction.
Mark, did I see your
Yeah,
hand?
just to add, that's a great point. But in fact, we are doing a lot of that kind of work. You heard Alex, a lot of the work he was talking about is exactly that, trying to look at the potential for greenhouse gas emission reduction as well as increases in soil carbon. We also have a related work on a project called Biosite, which is explicitly looking at the trade-offs or synergies between saving greenhouse gases and farm income, broader landscape environmental effects. So that's a great point. We are moving forward in that. Thank you.
Thank you. I see a hand at the back, and then I see also...
This is Alam Mandal from IFPRI. Just I want to mention about 80% CO2 emission comes from energy issues. So energy sector is vital for the climate change. So my question is how to develop sustainable agriculture or policy without linking the energy issues.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to the panel, because I see several hands, let me also take the virtual question, Simone.
Okay, the first says, would panelists like to see an SDG-style agenda come out of COP21, specifically in relation to the research and policy recommendations that were mentioned today? And the second question asks, says, climate change and food insecurity dramatically affect dry land areas where pastoralism is a way of living. How do we address?
Okay, so 3 questions: energy, SDG style agenda, and dry land agriculture. And how would you like to address whichever one you feel appropriate? And perhaps, why don't I walk down this panel? Keith, whichever one you want to address that you feel.
Acknowledge the first one. I mean, the question about the energy emissions, that just like we have to see climate change in the context of other drivers, we have to see agriculture in the context of other sectors that interlink critically in the whole climate question. So energy is obviously an important input into agriculture that we need to look at closely, and acknowledge that whatever we do in agriculture just takes place in a larger context. I don't have much to say on the other two. I would, my initial reaction on the question about SDGs is that was a torturous process, and maybe we could build on that rather than start another process that tries to go in the same direction.
You feel that too. Alex, do you want to come in on any of these questions?
I'm not sure I have. Regarding the SDGs, I mean, it's really hard to predict what is going to happen to COP. I mean, we have gone to these kind of events with so many different expectations at times, with high expectations, low expectations, and so far, honestly, not much has happened. So I don't know if we could have expectations about sort of a new process of this kind. I'm really curious to see if we shouldn't be surprised, because we're really messing with global interests and entrenched interests, and when you start sort of changing things around, people are going to lose money and power. So I don't know. We'll see what happens, and we're going to obviously raise our flag, and mostly, I think what is important, the message that I think is important, is that we're starting to have serious tools for decision makers that go beyond sort of, that can actually help decision makers to go beyond the power of the lobbies and the power of the strong voices. That's, I think, and my hope, at least for our contribution at COP, is that, look, we have developed some tools that can help you really with making deciding, sort of planning and deciding your policies.
Thank you, Alex. Heather, any quick?
Yeah, just briefly, I think there are 2 things that make this COP different from previous COPs, and that really are quite different from how the SDGs have played out so far, even though, of course, there's a lot of intersections. Those 2 things are, one, already 150 countries have put commitments in one form or another on the table in terms of their climate action. They vary a huge amount in terms of what countries are doing and what they're planning to do. Those commitments don't keep warming themselves below 2 degrees, but they do potentially put in motion a process of continuous improvement of these commitments. And this is my hope for this COP, that foundation of a very large participation by countries will be built upon. The second thing that's different is that the work of corporations, of NGOs, of research institutes like IFPRI is more prominent at this COP than it's ever been before. And there's special processes set out and days set aside at this COP that explicitly recognize that non-governmental action. And to really leverage that action is, I think, another opportunity we're seeing here. I wanted to briefly just mention energy. At WRI, we have work underway on the water energy nexus and really looking at that specific linkage that's so important for agriculture and for energy. So trying to figure out how do we look at those synergies in ways that can have wins in both areas. And we have work underway in China and India. So those are some thoughts.
And just to mention, yeah, the point about pastoralism is very important. I think it hasn't had enough attention because it's so difficult to measure, to track those systems and the effect we have. We saw already, just in the brief slide from Alex, how pasture land and production from pasture can have huge, how you handle it can have huge differences in greenhouse gas effects. And I think better understanding and if, empowerment or management improvements in pastoralism could also have major positive or negative effects depending on how it's done. So that was a very good point there as well.
Thank you, Mark. I know there are hands up here, but for one moment, if I may exercise prerogative to follow up with Heather. Heather, you mentioned the two ways in which this COP is different, and the last point you made about the work of corporations, researchers, civil society, very prominent, and to leverage. Any further thoughts on how we can leverage, not just at COP, but after COP? How do we not miss this opportunity? If you want to answer now, that's great. If you want to reflect and come back to it also. But to me, it's a very key point.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's two examples where I think there's potential and a bit of momentum. The first one is around cities. Cities have been so active in the lead up to this COP, and it's extraordinary when you look at some of the commitments that cities, governments are bringing to the table, and the ways in which that bottom-up commitment to climate change action, both on the emissions side and the resilience side, puts pressure on national governments to come to the table in a different way in Paris this year. And so that's one that I'm really optimistic about and encouraged by. And I think one of the questions is actually the finance and whether and how some of this global climate finance can get directly to that source of really strong innovation and action. The second one, where some of my own work is targeted right now, is on the resilience side and the extraordinary diversity of activities and ideas and initiatives that are out there on climate change resilience, from the very smallest community scale to global level observation systems. It's a tremendous mix, and it's accelerating, it's diversifying. There's some exciting things emerging. If there were a way to kind of have an official periodic event of every 5 years, akin to what our colleagues in the disaster risk reduction community do with their global platform for disaster risk reduction, I think it would be a very powerful thing to have that kind of non-governmental synthesis and convening of action feed formally into decisions within the UNFCCC and elsewhere. So figuring out how to structure that and formalize it a little bit would be very helpful to the process of making sense of this kind of crazy foment of things on resilience, but then also bringing some of what's best from that diversity to bear on these global decisions.
Thank you. And Keith, you wanted to come in for a moment.
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of things that Heather said about resilience in general, but also you mentioned the private sector a little bit earlier. And that's a key constituency. And we've had some conversation with the Lloyd's Insurance Group, which as a major insurer and reinsurer has a huge stake in the potential impact of climate change on extreme events and damages associated with that. And so obviously they're very careful and deliberate about assessing risks and the potential costs of risks, but historically or traditionally they've done that based on very careful analysis of historic patterns, and they're increasingly realizing that that's no longer sufficient. And so they're more and more interested in the types of scenarios that models can allow and looking at what some of those potential costs are. And I think that's an increasing source of demand and potentially of resources to do this type of analysis as well. And also an important constituency going beyond the public and the agricultural sector, but looking at other parts of the private sector as well.
And thank you, Keith.
Some people were
Yes,
there.
and I also have hands over here first. There were two gentlemen in this. Yes, the first one over here, and then just 2 seats away.
Thank you. I'm Pat O'Toole. I guess I would be described personally as a pastoralist. We ranch in Wyoming, Colorado. I'm also president of the Family Farm Alliance, and we represent about 3/4 of the irrigators in the West. We wrote a paper on climate in 2007 when no one in agriculture was writing papers about adaptability. Yet I will tell you that the sense in the country is that there's going to be regulatory systems that are going to overlay production agriculture that farmers are very concerned about, whether it be an irrigator or a grazer. And I guess what we've begun saying is adaptation rather than agendas. And how do you feel that that's sort of emerging at this point?
Thank you. Can you pass the mic along to the gentleman there? Yeah. If you don't mind, colleagues, I'll just collect 2 or 3 questions at this time. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. So I was going to...
Your name and
My name is Ethan Gilbert, and I'm from Solutions from the Land. And I had a question kind of going back to the question that was posed earlier about the opportunity of agriculture serving as a solution in this space of addressing climate change. And I'm curious, there was a lot of effort that went into developing the RED program, which focuses a lot on forestry and its ability to serve as a climate change solution and climate sink opportunities. So I'm curious, do you think there's potential? What would it take to develop a similar program for agriculture that has a similar intention of developing incentives and kind of protocols for measuring, verifying, and reporting changes or efforts in agriculture to sequester carbon and act as that mitigating factor?
Thank you very much. And I'll take the last question here.
Hello, I'm Peter Richards. I'm at USAID. I had a question that was really more specific to Heather and Keith, but Alex and Mark, please also, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But I guess the flip side of the 2008 price increase was that we also had an incredible supply response. I think cereals increased from about 2 billion tons up to about 2.6 in 7-year period. I think that's almost a historic increase for cereals. We also had major increases for beef. And so I guess my question is, to what extent do we truly understand the capacity of the agricultural sector to adapt? And given what we've learned from this pretty incredible natural experiment, I'll call it now, how can that help shape our ability to increase global agriculture's ability to produce for the future?
Thank you very much. Let me now turn back to the panel, and I'll also ask you, as you respond to these questions or comments, any closing message you want to leave with our participants here. And let me walk in reverse order, starting with Keith and coming and...
Okay, well, and maybe I'll take the questions in reverse order as well. Thanks for pointing out that issue of supplier response, because that really is a critical part of the story. And to see the flip side of the flip side, if you will, when prices have come down since 2008, you see the interest in the ag agenda declining correspondingly, and the attention of policymakers also shifting to other types of concerns. So that's a challenge in both ways, but I agree with you that there's tremendous potential and tremendous responsiveness, not only to price signals, but relates to one of the other questions of the gentleman who's just left now, but in terms of the regulatory environment as well. And I think we have to see that as a potential, that there is, here are 500 million private sector decision makers, if you will, around the world that are obviously paying attention to price signals and regulatory signals and incentives in general. And we need to find a way to guide that and make use of that, as opposed to trying to overcome it with heavy-handed measures. So I guess that sort of addresses the first question as well, in terms of farmers' adaptation versus regulatory response. So you have to have both. I mean, markets are made of regulatory systems, but I think they have to be carefully shaped, and Mark alluded a little bit earlier to some potentially, or some distortionary policies that we could win in a couple of dimensions, both in terms of saving resources and in terms of improving incentives by reducing subsidies for inefficient use of resources, for example, and that those are tools that we really need to fully take advantage of. The question on RED and the potential in agriculture, I'll defer that one to Alex. But in closing, I would just say that the results that I shared are just, well, they're almost final, but we're working on writing those up in a report that will be available within the next couple of months. And so please do keep in touch for more information on that. And meanwhile, as Reginald said, the presentation itself will be available on the website. So thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Alex?
I'm going to address your question about solutions in agriculture. That's, this idea of agriculture as part of the solution of climate change, not just the problem. This is actually how I started at IFPRI. When I joined IFPRI, my job was just looking at potential for reduction of emissions in agriculture, in particular crop production. Yes, the potential is there. The truth is that it's incredibly complicated because the solutions are very location specific, and it's hard to come up with general guidelines, and you can go out and say, do this, and that will work everywhere. It doesn't. And on top of that, a lot of the potential gains, so when you think about agriculture as part of the solution, is in the storage of carbon in the soil. A lot of those gains, which are really, really slow to accumulate, they get lost very quickly. And so if you're dealing with a very dynamic sector and very dynamic decision makers, because farmers need to follow price signals and they have to think about their livelihood, the risk of seeing those gains lost very quickly is high. And so from sort of accumulating carbon in the soil, we move to reduction of emissions, so fluxes. So we have focused on rice, for instance. And so that really shows some promises. AWD, system rice intensification, and so there are some practices there. But what I have discovered, and this is what, I don't know if this is my final message too, which is the real potential is in how agriculture relates to other land uses. Because that's where big gains can be made. And how sort of it relates to forests, how it relates to marginal land that is degraded. Not so much in accumulating carbon in this sort of agricultural soils, which is more a question of productivity. So farmers should do it, right? So there are reasons for why they don't do it and so on. But I think that we need to shift the focus on from just looking at crop production and have a larger focus on how agriculture relates to the other land uses. And those, I think, where the big gains are.
Thank you, Alex. Great message. Heather?
I think Alex's last point there really points to the importance of landscapes and looking at them holistically and considering that big picture when you're thinking about emissions. In terms of this issue of adaptation, not agendas. Unfortunately, we lost our questioner, so we can't probe exactly what that means. I do think there's a need to integrate adaptation into a range of different agendas. And for a small farmer in America, that looks pretty different than in the developing world. But we need really effective ways of getting the private sector to pay attention to adaptation, and I think that's a rich agenda that needs work from a number of angles. We have a paper coming out shortly from WRI on micro and small enterprises as one really important element of that private sector picture. We typically think of the big reinsurers because they're so powerful and important, but when you consider how many people in the developing world are employed by very small businesses, including agricultural businesses, then leveraging that that effort, that private effort toward resilience becomes another very important picture. At the big scale, this question about the supply response to the 2008 food price spikes raises the question of how do we adapt the global economy? Thinking about the agricultural sector as a global entity rather than something that national governments write policies on, or that individual farmers play out on a season-to-season basis. That those global dynamics remain pretty unexplored, and there may be whole new definitions of resilience and adaptation that can come from probing that. So put that on the to-do list. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Heather. And Mark, do you want to come in and also address the red question?
Yeah, let me say something. Yeah, I think Alex has already addressed it quite nicely, but I think there's also a bigger issue that, I mean, the agriculture sector and those of us who work on it, I think, have had a major failure in sort of organization and in, I mean, you could even call it public relations and how we present ourselves. So that in much of the world, agriculture is demonized. So it's, as you said, it's the source of all the problems and not the source of solutions. And within agriculture, there's huge fights between those who favor organics versus those who believe intensive agriculture technology is required. The fact is we probably need to do all of those things to get it right, but we need to do it in a way that is, as the others have said, takes account of landscapes, land use change, and appropriate incentives, so that I think until the agriculture sector starts to, not fight back, but starts to present itself, what are the options for improvement, that it's not going to have any stance in the kind of negotiating the way that the red community has been quite effective to do. So I think that's a major thing that still needs to be done in the agriculture sector.
Thank you very much. Our panelists have shared with us a number of very interesting work, ideas, challenges, even the suggestion of doing a periodic event every 5 years, a kind of a COP++ maybe. But a number of key things they've put on the table over here, and I think they are also hearing from you some key messages for Paris and beyond. So please join me in thanking them, and best wishes as we get ready for Paris.